Hey there, welcome to the Energy Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Ari Whitten, and today I have with me Brad Dieter, Dr. Brad Dieter, who is a trained exercise physiologist, molecular biologist, and biostatistician. He received his bachelor's from Washington State University and a master's of science in biomechanics at the University of Idaho and completed his PhD at the University of Idaho. He completed his postdoctoral fellowship in translational science at Providence Medical Research Center, Providence Sacred Heart Medical Center, and Children's Hospital, where he studied how metabolism and inflammation regulate molecular mechanisms that drive disease, and was involved in discovering novel therapeutics for diabetic complications. Currently, Dr. Dieter is the Chief Scientific Officer at Eat to Perform, Chief Scientific Advisor at Outplay Incorporated, and is active in health technology and biotechnology. In addition, he's passionate about scientific outreach and educating the public through his role on scientific advisory boards and regular writing on health, nutrition, and supplementation, which is where I found him. I've been reading his work, his articles online for a couple of years now. I've always been very, very impressed with his stuff. It's just very objective, very scientific, and he's put the pieces together and compiled some really great data on a number of kind of leading edge topics. For example, stuff related to the keto diet, exogenous ketone supplementation, compiling all the evidence around what the research says and how that compares to some of the claims that people are making. And he's just doing a lot of great work that I really appreciate. So I had to have him on the show. So welcome, Dr. Dieter. Such a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. I know you and I have kind of connected tangentially over the years, so it's great to meet, I guess, via e-person, not in person.
Yes, almost in person. We're one step closer than Facebook chat.
Yeah, perfect. Awesome. Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me here. I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, likewise. So I want to talk to you about, kind of nutrition myths, fat loss myths. Maybe we'll get some tips on energy in here since this is the Energy Blueprint. I want to start off with a post that you did maybe last week that I was really impressed with and also surprised by, given that you kind of are, I would say to a large extent, kind of entrenched in the sort of conventional medical world. And, as a biomedical researcher, as I said, you kind of did these fellowships and training at these medical research centers. So you're very much in that world, working with pharmaceutical companies and things like that. So I was very surprised to hear you, or to see you, I should say, writing this post that said a few things. And I'm going to just summarize a few points here without going into the whole long post. But point one was, you said we have yet to see the full burden of chronic disease on our population, and the surging tide is still rising. And so you're talking about kind of obesity and diabetes and a lot of chronic disease more broadly. Number two, you said medicine, especially in the US, is not designed to deal with these sorts of issues. Number three, there's a motif that healthcare is a right for all of us, but there also needs to be a motif that, quote, health is a responsibility for all of us. And then the fourth one, you said, this is the most surprising part to me, said it's becoming increasingly obvious that we are unlikely to solve these large issues through pharmacological approaches or through medical interventions. So, and again, to everybody listening, I'm leaving out a lot of the details of what he wrote for each one, because I would like to have you discuss, sort of paint this picture of why you wrote this post and what you mean by it.
Yeah. So, my, maybe I'll color that with a little bit of my journey through kind of biomedical science. That'll kind of help put a lens on that, and then I'll kind of dive into each piece. So I actually started my kind of biomedical research career coming at it from more of a like exercise as medicine idea. That was how I started, and then got, pretty heavily entrenched in biomedical research, because that's kind of just where I ended up. I always kind of had that lens of, how do we think about medicine from both perspectives of, how does the human body, how is it involved in its own health? And then, from a kind of a Western allopathic medicine view, how do we address a lot of these health issues? So I've kind of always had both tracks of thought kind of going through my career. And, one of the things that, if you've ever written scientific papers, or read scientific papers is they always have the same introduction, right? It's always like, oh my God, there's this huge health issue. Now I'm going to tell you about how we're going to solve it, etc. Right? And so when you spend enough time, writing those types of papers and seeing the data over a decade, just the numbers continue to grow, and you start to realize the problems that we thought we had are smaller than the problems we actually have, right? And they're continuing to get bigger. We've seen obesity rates as, prevalence percentage, right? The percentage of the population is growing. Every year we kind of hit a new peak of prevalence. And the other piece that comes with that is the number of people on the planet is increasing, right? So not only are we seeing a higher percentage of people, but we're just seeing more people in general, right? So maybe it's, 100 million people this year, next year it's 120 million, and next year it's 140 million. And so these burdens start to grow, and it's not going to get smaller faster, right? So it's going to take at least some time to correct the prevalence and decrease it, and then maybe those numbers will start to drop. But we still haven't hit kind of, critical mass. We're still going to be seeing at least numbers of people rising. And if you look at the projections, even the pretty conservative projections, they get really scary really quick in terms of how many people are kind of, affected by a lot of these chronic health issues.
Yeah. So I think I'm sure we could talk for a long time about all of this, but I think the biggest shocking thing was the last part, that it's becoming increasingly obvious that we're unlikely to solve these large issues through pharmacological approaches or through medical interventions. This is something I completely share your view, by the way, and I think we come from similar backgrounds, like in the fitness, nutrition space, appreciating the power of exercise and nutrition as being like the most powerful forms of medicine. And I've always, kind of felt this way, that it's always been somewhat obvious to me that these diseases are not rapidly being cured by pharmaceuticals. There's this constant pursuit, constant talk. There's been talk since the 1940s or 50s of, we're right on the verge of curing cancer and we have the pharmaceuticals to do it. And all this talk of curing all these other diseases. And what we've actually seen during this time, as we've poured trillions of dollars into pharmaceuticals, and pharmaceutical research, is a huge skyrocketing of the disease burden and the emergence of all sorts of new chronic diseases.
So and I think this is one of the areas where a lot of nuance is kind of needed, because I think a lot of times people have two very polarizing views. And I think I've been in a unique position to see a little bit of both sides. So there's, one is, I think the most important thing is to realize there's prevention, there's treatment, and there's management, right? And for a lot of people who do have kind of established disease, a lot of the modern pharmaceuticals are fairly effective at disease management, right? And that's really what they are used for. I think most people who are especially kind of in the medical community would be pretty open in saying, a lot of these kind of chronic diseases that are treated with pharmacotherapy are really for management, right? We know insulin is not the cure for diabetes, right? But it does allow you to live longer. We know that even the new frontline medications like the GLP-1 receptor agonists, some of the other newer ones like that, they are just basically, how can we prevent or slow disease progression, right? That's really what they're meant for. And so
sorry to interrupt. I just want to interject one thing about that, which is I completely agree with that distinction. I think the problem is the general public who is not educated on health, who are not educated on health, don't understand that distinction. And they think they're going to go to their doctor who's trained in disease management and get whatever the latest science is that's shown how to cure or reverse that disease or prevent that disease for that matter. And that's just not what they're going to get in the vast majority of cases.
Yes, exactly. Right. And I think that's a big piece is people don't really understand how we are managing disease, how we're not really treating it. And I think one of the fundamental things that we've learned from a lot of the research over the last, several decades is most of these chronic diseases are incredibly complex, right? Even if you have type 2 diabetes, it's not just a singular thing. There's a lot of pieces to it. And trying to cure it with a drug or a series of drugs is very unlikely, right? We've pretty much gotten to that point, and so even if there is some sort of medical intervention that is quote unquote a cure, it's a long ways away, and it's probably going to look something completely different than modern medicine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first piece, and I think the other piece to kind of tie in some of the other ones is the prevention piece is huge, and that is a kind of social responsibility piece, right? Is one that doesn't really fall on the medical establishment. Two, the medical establishment is not designed to handle that, right? Physicians are trained a specific way. They're not designed to handle that. The insurance system is designed a certain way. It's not designed to handle that. Hospitals, the whole system is just not, it's designed for more acute medical care. And some chronic disease management for things like, cancers or other diseases like that, but it's really not designed for the burden that we're placing on it.
Yeah. I think this prevention piece is massively important. To add to your point, it is actually insane to me. It's absurd that we don't focus more on it, because I'm sure you're familiar with David Katz, nutrition researcher and head of Yale's Prevention Research Center. He's written extensively in articles and his books that 80% of the chronic disease burden could basically be eliminated from taking, I think it's like 4 basic steps. It's like stop smoking, stop drinking, do exercise like 30 minutes a day, and make some simple nutrition changes. So we're not even talking about, this is like scratching the surface of like the first little layer of knowledge of the most basics of the basics, as far as, someone like your expertise or my expertise in nutrition and lifestyle strategies. We could go 50 levels deeper than that, but just those few simple steps could probably eliminate 80% of the disease burden. A huge amount of obesity, diabetes, cancer, autoimmune disease, so many other chronic diseases, eliminate a huge chunk of it. And we already know how to do that. And we're not doing it. We're pouring 90% of the research money into disease management and pharmaceuticals.
Yeah. And I think this is just my perspective on that issue, is kind of allocation of resources. One is a finite problem that you can come to a solution with a given amount of time that will actually return money on an investment, right? The other one is really a very large, complex sociocultural issue that you have to get buy-in from hundreds of millions of people, and you kind of have to shift a whole culture and way of being. So one is, at least on one hand, there's at least some return of like, okay, there's something tangible I can feel good I did with my work. And there's another one of, I don't even know how to go about doing this, and it's probably not going to work anyway, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the mindsets when you think about it of, like, have you ever worked for a company culture where you go in and you're like, this culture is so broken, there's no way I can even think about fixing it, right? It's kind of like something almost as simple as that, is how do you take this and completely shift just the whole focus?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. One more aspect of this I want to dig into, which is point number 3. You said there's a motif, healthcare is a right for all of us, but there also needs to be the motif that health is a responsibility for all of us. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of a few layers to that. One is human beings, we all realize that we're going to get sick and die at some point, right? We're not immortal, we're biological creatures. And at some point we're going to put a burden on the rest of society to take care of us, right? That's just kind of what we're born with. But the choices you make in life really determine how much burden are you going to place on society, right? So as kind of an individual, we want to care for people when they're in places where they can't care for themselves. But you also don't want to, put a lot of extra burden on other people that is unnecessary, right? So think about somebody who, takes care of themselves, lives 70 years, needs care for the last 15 to 20 years of their life. We provide insurance for them even when they're not working. That's a much different story than somebody who starts accumulating healthcare costs at the age of 22, right? They're not productive members of society because of their health issues. And so when you think about it, is being treated for your health really is probably something that is a right that all people should have, right? As a collective society, we should give that to each other. But to do so, we have to take responsibility that we have to own that. And so if we don't share in that responsibility, we can't take care of everybody, right? It's kind of like, if you have a household and everybody's, let's say you're the only person making money and you have 9 people in your house and everybody's spending money, but only one person's making it. Where's the distribution of rights versus responsibilities? And so just kind of starting to think about, you do have a responsibility to your whole society of, okay, I need to contribute to this whole system of health and healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautifully said. There's a lot of different subjects we could talk about as far as nutrition, as far as exercise and health more broadly. I'd like to go into nutrition a bit with you here. I definitely want to cover, there's some specific topics I want to cover around carbs and fats and keto and things like that. We have this very polarized landscape when it comes to diet. Everything from hardcore veganism to, it's like the most extreme things that you could imagine of the, as far as the poles, from veganism to an all meat diet, which is something I never thought I would see, but now exists and is gaining popularity, the carnivore diet. So I'm just curious if you have, I don't want to, I want to ask for your input basically of where you think we should go, what would serve my audience the best, of which subtopics we could talk about here.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to make sure that I've got this list of questions that we have. And, I think, some of the things that I think would be the most helpful, are probably the topics of, what role do things like, carbohydrates and fats play in your diet, right? Of how, they've been very polarized, right? For decades, we had, high carbohydrate diets. We had a decade of very low carbohydrate, very high fat diets. So maybe we'll kind of start there and,
Perfect.
talk about, the pros and the cons and how to actually start thinking about those pieces.
Perfect. Cool. So as you said, we had this low fat era. We've now swung in the other direction. Low carb, high fats become popular. We've got keto. We've got the zero carb, all meat carnivore diet. Carbs and insulin in particular have been demonized to the extent, I'd say quite successfully demonized, to the extent that the majority of the population now thinks, things like carbs make you fat, fat doesn't make you fat, or insulin is the key regulator of our body fatness. So what's your take on that? Which aspects of that do you think are true or untrue?
Yeah, so one of the best parts about having decades of really polarizing kind of mass media topics is it seeps into the research world. So a lot of really cool research gets done. So the best part is we have a lot of the data to actually answer these questions. And so we can say with a pretty high level of confidence, what are the answers to these big questions? So to kind of start in probably small picture and kind of build up in maybe forward to backward time-wise is, kind of a lot of the recent research around kind of low carbohydrate diets, how hormones change with those, how those relate to fat loss, and then even, kind of optimal human performance have been really fleshed out. And so we've got some really good concrete data. And if you kind of summarize the literature, what we've learned from that is the percentage of your total energy intake, your total food intake in a day that comes from carbohydrates doesn't really appear to dictate body composition, doesn't really appear to dictate weight loss or weight gain, and doesn't really have a massive effect on, hormones, things like insulin or even things like leptin, which is another kind of fat mass regulating hormone.
And when you say insulin there, you're talking more baseline levels of insulin, like let's say your fasting levels of
Yes.
morning insulin as opposed to levels right after a meal.
Yeah, so your kind of baseline fasting levels of insulin, which is a marker of basically how insulin resistant or insulin sensitive your body is.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't really appear to matter for those metrics, which is really interesting, right? So it starts to tell us a lot about the body is pretty adept at using fuel sources to kind of compensate for total energy, right? And that a lot of these hormones really just kind of dictate when certain fuels are used. And we've kind of really learned that over the last 10 to 15 years. And there's been a series of really kind of elegant studies that have been really controlled in very scientific environments that have really fleshed that out, right? And we can say with high confidence that, the percentage of your diet that comes from carbohydrates or fat doesn't make a big difference for body composition. We do know that. Now, some of the disease states, things like, type 2 diabetes, things like cardiovascular disease, those typically are not greatly affected by carbohydrate or fat, distribution, right? Whether you're eating 10% carbohydrates or 90% carbohydrates, there's not a huge difference in terms of total risk of disease. The biggest factor is body weight and body weight loss. So if you lose body weight, you have a big reduction of risk of those types of diseases. And it doesn't matter what your diet is, right? So if you are, 110 pounds overweight and you lose 110 pounds on a low fat diet or a low carbohydrate diet, it doesn't matter what your approach is. That weight loss is going to contribute almost all of the risk reduction. So that's the other important piece, right? Which starts to tell us what we need to prioritize and what we need to focus. Now, I
want to interject just one thing, because you're saying some of the stuff you just said is like you're saying it so matter of factly, like it's already been proven, we already know it. Yeah. Yet I know for a lot of people listening who have been kind of entrenched in some of the, let's say, the low carb dogma around carbs are the devil, carbs are what's making us fat and driving disease and all that. I mean, you probably just completely rocked their world, and they're saying right now, this guy's crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah. And you're saying it so matter-of-factly, like it's already been so well established that you don't even have to prove it, which I would say is completely true in the world you're in like the research world, the academic world, the people who have read all this literature that you're referring to. However, for the average regular person, you just rock their world. So just go into that a little bit more and maybe talk about some of the layers of research that have led the scientific community to those conclusions.
Yeah, so, that's a very good point. And thank you for kind of stopping me and kind of doing a little bit deeper dive. So the way that I always conceptualize kind of scientific research is there's several layers to it, right? And one of the easiest ways for me to kind of put that across to people is the very top layer is what I call kind of idea generating, right? Where you just see things that are correlated or associated, and it's kind of an idea sparker, right? So in the context of this, a really good, place to start the investigation would be, a book like Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes, right? Where he draws a lot of kind of observational data of people in populations who've consumed higher carbohydrate diets, and they tend to be more overweight than other ones, right? So you kind of make an observation and you go, okay, these are correlated, so maybe this is the cause, right? So that's the first level. So when we look at that data, we can say, okay, there's definitely populations of people who have, higher carbohydrate content diets who are more overweight than other people. on the other side of the coin, there's also populations of people who have high carbohydrate diets who are some of the leanest people on the planet, right? We know that, right? So you've got populations like the Okinawans, you've got populations like the Catawbans, you have populations, even modern day, many vegan populations of people tend to consume very high carbohydrate diets and can have very low levels of body fat. So even from that level, we have some data that supports the idea and some data that disputes the idea. So then the next question is, you can go in kind of two directions. You can go into like very basic science, and you kind of look at, like, at the most zoomed in level, are carbohydrates actually causing your body to store fat at a greater rate than dietary fats? So we've done those studies. There's been several studies that were done in the 90s, and then there's been more studies that have been done in the last 4 years with just much more sophisticated techniques. And so those studies have actually taken people, randomized them to different carbohydrate or fat diets, and actually measured how much body fat is being added or lost at a very, very zoomed in level. And so those studies show that it doesn't really matter what you're consuming for body weight, right? So that's kind of the most zoomed in level. And then we have what I like to call kind of more, realistic scenarios of like, okay, maybe it's not the carbohydrates themselves that are inherently fattening, but maybe when you add them into your diet in like a normal life, they just change your whole body and how you interact with food to cause you to gain more weight. And so there's been a series of studies that have looked at that, whether they've been, randomized controlled trials, whether they've been free living eating studies, and all of them typically show, a very similar result to the very basic science investigations. So we've really examined this idea at several levels, right? As hardcore science as you can get, as high level as you can get, and kind of in the real world scenario, what does this look like? So what that tells you is diets can work. A whole lot of different diets can work. And the macronutrient composition, whether they're low carbohydrate or low fat, typically isn't the determining factor of whether they're successful.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Very well explained. So this is, shocking to a large extent. Basically what you're saying here is, for the last 30 years or so, 40 years maybe, or maybe even longer than 40 years now, this whole giant focus of the entire American population on fat and carbs is mostly missing the point. Is that accurate to say?
I would say very much so, with the caveat of, we didn't know what we didn't know.
Sure. Yeah. We had to learn that it was the wrong thing.
At the time, we were like, well, this makes sense. This might be the biggest, most important factor. So let's study it. And then we're like, oh crap, that didn't work, right? It's kind of like the pharmaceutical industry, right? We think we have a cure based on a drug, and then we use it, and we compare it to exercise, and we go, well, exercise was better than the drug that we spent $10 billion, discovering. So you don't know until you actually do the work.
Like in Alzheimer's, there was, the theory for a long time that the beta amyloid plaques are the cause of the symptoms and the progression of the disease. And then they spent all this money developing a drug that interrupts the synthesis of these amyloid plaques. And they're like, yes, this is going to cure Alzheimer's. And then they actually discovered that it accelerates the progression of the disease, and that the amyloid plaques are probably serving some kind of protective role, and they're not the thing that's driving the disease process.
Yep, exactly.
So one other layer to this story is just like, so if it's not carbs and fats that are the thing that's driving fat gain, what is?
Yeah, so typically what we see is it's a combination of a few things. One is total energy consumption, right? We're just consuming more food now than we have been historically. That tends to be driven by the availability of food, right? It's so much easier now to get high energy density foods than it was even 30 years ago. just the way food is made. We've got Uber Eats, you can have everything delivered. Our lives are much different. We eat out at restaurants way more than we used to.
I have to just say that I have a new baby right now, and Uber Eats is coming in very handy. So don't bash Uber Eats right now.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, and I'm, I use that kind of stuff too, just because our lives are so different, right? So just, we consume more energy just based on a whole lot of factors, right? It's not, oh, we have a higher percentage of our diet is fat or carbohydrates. Our diet is a higher percentage, or it's a higher amount of both.
Mm-hmm.
So energy intake's been a big piece. Another piece is physical activity levels, right? If you look at historical data, the drop in physical activity levels is pretty dramatic. And it's, from jobs changing from more physically active jobs to more sedentary jobs. People drive way more than they used to. They ride bikes way less than they used to. Their kind of recreational time activity is a lot less than it used to be. So those are the two very unsexy answers, but they're the most accurate answers. And there's been a couple papers that have been published that have basically said, if we look at, obesity rates, or, body mass index changes over a 40-year period, and we track the increase in energy intake and the decrease in energy expenditure, those almost completely explain the change in body composition, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's a very simple idea, but it's also horrendously complex of like, okay, well, how do we fix that, right? It's very difficult.
Now, just to kind of loop back to the carbs and fats for just a moment, for people listening to what you just said who are going, oh, this guy believes in calories in, calories out. He's not up on the latest research that insulin is the key factor that's driving our body fatness. What would you say? And you, having said that, you already explained all the layers of research debunking this hypothesis. What would you say in response to somebody thinking that right now?
Yeah. So what I would say is, people who say that, they have some nuggets of truth, right? Is they're not crazy and they're not completely wrong. One of the things we do know is that the calories in, calories out piece explains body weight change, right? But that doesn't explain the calories out piece, right? Of like, what makes up your caloric expenditure? How do hormones affect that? And then, how does nutrient selection affect that, right? And so we do know that, there's some effects of, what your macronutrient ratio is. It has small effects on, the calories in, calories out equation. And the important thing is to not take those small truths and let them kind of override some of the bigger principles, right? And that's what I usually, whenever people, tell me that, we kind of go into the details, right? So if somebody says, okay, how does, carbohydrates have a bigger effect on insulin than, dietary fat? And then you go, okay, well, how much does that actually affect your fat mass change over the next 6 months? And you kind of go into, okay, well, it's, 0.1%. Okay. Does that really matter? How is your nutrient selection affecting your satiety and your hunger, right? Are carbohydrates or fat more satiating? And kind of, talking about the research about that. And then structuring the conversation about that piece, because we do know that, the idea of a calorie is a calorie is kind of not the right discussion to have, right? It's more pedantic than it needs to be, and it doesn't really help people understand their food better, right? Anybody who says, 500 calories from Twinkies and 500 calories from salad are the same thing. It's like, okay, as a unit of energy, it's the same thing, but in the context of your actual diet, they're two completely different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what about, let's throw keto into the mix now. There's obviously been a lot of claims around keto, this, especially in the last, maybe we're going on 5 or 10 years now. But especially in the last couple of years, keto has really surged in popularity. And there's all these claims from it's way more effective for fat loss, to it makes you a super athlete, to it gives you tons of energy, to it's the ancestral way of eating that our human ancestors ate traditionally, and it's the correct, most optimal diet for human physiology. what do you think of some of these claims?
Yeah, so there's kind of the hardcore scientific answer, and then there's the pragmatic answer. And maybe I'll start with the pragmatic answer. So I think for a lot of people, it has been a useful tool to kind of initiate weight loss for a lot of people. I think it's a huge shock in dietary pattern, right? You completely change the way you eat. It limits a lot of your food selection. It typically promotes more higher protein intake. And it a lot of times will change people's view on food, right? So I think from a pragmatic standpoint is it can be a very useful tool for people. And a lot of times whenever people lose weight or have a big change in their, kind of their dietary patterns, they do see big benefits in, health, mental clarity, energy, the way they feel, etc. Now, when you kind of take that and then go below the surface is what do we know about this way of eating, right? What do we know about the physiological state of ketosis? And then how does it map to all those other pieces? And that's a much different question. And so if we kind of dive into those questions, we do know that, ketones in general, whether they're elevated from, low carbohydrate intake, just if you don't eat at all, whether it's, if it's low everything, you're going to have high levels of ketones in your body. It's not just if you eat a bunch of fat, or if you take exogenous ketones. That state doesn't really have any effect on body fat loss, right? So if you're in a state of ketosis versus if you're not in a state of ketosis, it doesn't really make a difference for body weight loss or even, body fat mass loss, right?
So what's the distinction there? Because one of the claims made is, things to the effect of it turns you into a fat burning machine and makes your body super efficient at burning fat, quote unquote. So how could it be doing that, but still not matter as far as body fat loss?
Yeah. So you've got to realize that your body fat mass and the amount of fat you're burning at a given moment are two very different things. Now that's kind of a hard idea to wrap your mind around, right? But the amount of fat you're oxidizing at a given moment and the percentage of it doesn't translate to your changes in body mass, right? Your changes in fat mass. It's kind of a weird concept, but that's what we see, right? Is your amount of fat oxidation is really just which substrate your body's using, and its stores of carbohydrates can get turned into fat and stores of fats can get turned into carbohydrates, and they will over time balance out based on energy balance, right? It's a weird way the body works, but it's kind of just the way that it works and how we go about doing it. Now, the thing where people say, you've got to, if you eat fat, you burn fat, you're also just burning the fat that you've eaten, right? So if you were to eat a lot of carbohydrates, you're going to burn carbohydrates and you're going to burn stored body fat. If you eat dietary fat, you're going to burn the dietary fat and then burn some body fat. So you're kind of getting the same amount of stored body fat utilization regardless of what you're burning on top of it. So that's kind of probably the best answer for that question.
So in other words, let's say like you eat a 2,000 calorie a day diet with lots of potatoes and lentils versus a diet with lots of fatty foods, let's say egg yolks and avocados and red meat and things like that. And on one diet, you have mostly carbs, but still 2,000 calories. The other diet is mostly fat and it's 2,000 calories. You've got to burn through whatever excess energy, whether it's coming from carbs or fats, before you're actually tapping into burning off your body fat. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And that's exactly what we see in all the scientific research. And if anything, it actually appears that lower fat intake may actually be a little more efficient at burning body fat. It's not a big effect, but that's tends to be what we see. And it's just the way your body will store carbohydrates and how much energy it takes versus storing dietary fats as body fat. It's just kind of it's like an energy tax, right? You pay more energy tax consuming carbohydrates than you do dietary fats.
Gotcha. What about some of these other proposed benefits of the keto diet? What are any of them legitimate, or where are they legitimate and not so legitimate?
So, there are some definite benefits for specific situations. We do know there's some medical conditions that ketogenic diets can be beneficial for. Specifically, some of the neurological things that it's been kind of really fleshed out. So things like intractable epilepsy, it appears to have, a therapeutic benefit. Now, outside of that, there are not a lot of very clearly defined and demarcated benefits of either a ketogenic diet, the state of ketosis, or exogenous ketones that have been really fleshed out. None of them that we've really studied have shown a big effect. The one that there may be a benefit of that's still kind of disputed, but shows up pretty strongly in the literature as a small effect is hunger, right? As there does appear to be some small effect on hunger, in the fact that it actually reduces hunger a little bit. So that's kind of the big piece that we've actually seen. And typically, the other benefit that kind of goes along with that is people tend to consume a little fewer calories when they're on a ketogenic diet than when they're on anything else. That's one of the other things that we see. Now, whether that's due to, the hunger suppressing effect of elevated levels of ketones in the blood, or whether it's just because they typically tend to eat higher protein intakes and a lot more like satiating vegetables than different dietary patterns, it's really up for debate and discussion right now. So there's been a group of us who've kind of looked at all that literature, and we're still trying to figure out, how much of it is due to one versus the other actual effect.
Interesting. So you mentioned exogenous ketones there for a moment. These are ketone supplements, basically, that people can take to, even if they're not necessarily eating a strict low carb diet, they can take some of these ketone supplements and then get some of the effects or proposed benefits of having these ketones in your bloodstream. Do you think, is there any legitimate benefit of those? They're obviously very expensive. So to make sense of that, they should be giving some very significant benefit if they're very costly. So do they?
So they're expensive. They generally don't taste very good if you get like a really potent dose.
So now they really got to do something amazing.
Yeah. So we do know that if you take exogenous ketones, your blood levels of ketones will, basically increase, and you'll be in a state of ketosis, so to speak. Now, within the next 6 to 12 hours of you taking those, most of those will show up in your urine. So you're basically peeing out most of them. There was a paper by, I think it was Lewis Burke who did it, who actually looked at urine kinetics of ketones and kind of showed how much you're peeing out, like right after you take them over the next couple hours. So we do know that those things occur.
Now, is it possible they could have some effect during the time they're in our body and then we pee them out, or do they need to be sort of like taken up by the cell and utilized within the cell to have effects?
Yeah, so they will have to be taken up and utilized, and they are, right? When you take them, your body doesn't have a storage capacity for ketones, so that's why they get metabolized, quote unquote, preferentially to other substrates, right? And now what we do know is your body will kind of delay metabolizing carbohydrates and fats to metabolize ketones, right? It's kind of like when you drink alcohol, it kind of puts the brakes on some of the other pieces and burns alcohol, oxidizes it or breaks it down instead of using the other ones. So what it does is it kind of suppresses some of your other metabolic processes to do that. Now, there's some idea that might be beneficial for kind of sustained physical activity on really long duration stuff. If you're working out at a pretty minimal exercise capacity, like 40 to 50% of your max effort, which is pretty low, that taking exogenous ketones might delay your body from using its internal stores, so you can kind of sustain that a little bit longer, right? Now, could you just consume extra actual food and have the same effect? It's still up for debate. But what we do know is it doesn't really benefit high intensity exercise. If anything, it tends to make it worse. And for things like diabetes, weight loss, or anything like that, there's no established benefit for, weight loss or kind of disease management. And if anything, there's some rationale to suggest that, if you're taking something that prevents your body from metabolizing its stored nutrients, you're probably doing more harm than good.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, so I want to leave this topic of carbs and fats and keto. I feel like we've covered that sufficiently. Any tips that you have related to energy levels and maybe nutrition factors or other lifestyle factors that could relate to energy? And having said, energy is what my whole brand is built around, but the science here is complex because energy, as you can imagine, is a tough thing to measure. It's even hard to measure like mitochondrial energy production at the cellular level. We don't really have good tests for that either. So energy is this kind of subjective state that we all experience and we all know is very real. And yet from a hardcore research, biomedical perspective, it's sort of this nebulous concept that's like researchers don't really want to research energy and energy levels because it's too subjective and too hard to measure. But having said that, we all know it's real. Do you have any tips that relate to helping people increase their energy levels?
Yeah, what I would say is, in no exact order of priority, is one is make sure you're sleeping. I think a lot of people's energy problems are just they're not sleeping enough.
Mm-hmm.
I throw myself under that bus pretty regularly, so that's something I have to work on quite a bit. The other one is, I think people very much underappreciate the effect dieting has on your energy levels, right? I mean, people who are constantly dieting are kind of existing on a pretty low energy intake, just like food wise, you're probably going to really struggle with energy levels. There's a lot of science that you could go into, but basically the human body, when it's functioning at a high level, you're moving around a lot, you're pretty high energy and you're doing things, should be, burning 2,500, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 calories a day. And so you should be consuming an adequate amount of food to kind of fuel actual physical work and kind of mental work. I think a lot of people spend a lot of time on kind of chronic dieting cycles, like in and out, and they just spend a lot of their time low energy because they just don't have a lot coming in. Mm-hmm. And then they don't move very much because they have no energy. So they just kind of stay in this, I'm gonna burn 1,800 calories a day and eat 1,600 calories a day. And there's actual studies that have looked at, what is that energy flux and how do people do if they're, eating 3,500 calories a day and expending 3,500 calories a day versus eating 1,800 and burning 1,800. And the results are just so substantially different. It would kind of blow your mind.
I'm so glad you brought this up because this has actually been a pet interest of mine, the research around the concept of energy flux. And I've been shocked, to see, I've been reading the research on this and really I've considered it a big concept for, at least 5 or 6 years. And I've just been shocked to see so few people in the evidence-based nutrition and fitness communities, and, kind of the fat loss area, of people in that whole community just talking about the concept of energy flux and referring to these studies. It seems to be almost like a little bit of a hidden secret that not a lot of people have figured out, but I'm absolutely convinced it's not only a big deal when it comes to fat loss, but also to energy levels.
Yeah. And it's kind of one of those ideas when you think about it, it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is like your Toyota Tercel is not a high energy, high performance car, right? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't eat a lot of gas, but your Ferrari does, right? Mm-hmm. So just kind of, how much energy something requires to put out requires you to put into it. So you can't have high levels of energy if you don't have high levels of energy coming in.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other some of the other pieces to it are, kind of managing your own self, right? And that sounds really nebulous, but like I kind of have learned when I'm high energy and when I'm low energy and what that takes, right? I know that I have a lot of energy in the mornings, but at night I crash, right? I know that if I have too much caffeine, it's not a good thing. If I don't have enough caffeine, it's also not a good thing. Stress levels. How do I handle stress? Some people are, wired for high stress and they can just go. Other people are too much stress kind of just shuts them down. So it's kind of being a little bit self-aware of how you're wired to kind of interact with the world too.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talked a lot about diet, like debunking a lot of myths. I'm curious, and probably a lot of listeners are curious, what kind of diet do you eat?
That is a good question. And it fluctuates quite a bit. I would say throughout the year, it fluctuates quite a bit. Over years and cycles, it fluctuates quite a bit. I try to eat to like what I'm doing. So when I was in graduate school and I was working a ton, and I was not, I was working out every day, but it was like 35 to 40 minutes of just kind of dinking around in the gym, basically is what it was. It looked a lot more like a kind of lower carbohydrate, higher protein diet, right? Because I didn't want to eat 6 meals a day. I didn't want to eat a ton of calories because I wasn't expending a lot because I was sitting at the computer in the lab. So it was a pretty, vegetable rich, meat rich, nut rich kind of diet. Then when I got done with graduate school and I was doing a lot more, kind of endurance type of training, I was riding my bike a lot. I was running a lot. I started to eat, my calorie intake went up 1,500, 2,000 calories a day. Started eating a lot more starch. Was doing some extra supplementation. Then when I switched to doing more like Olympic weightlifting, my calorie intake stayed the same, but I shifted my carbohydrates and fats around. So it's always been changing, but the constants have always been, kind of understanding my energy needs and my energy balance. And do I need to lose body weight? Do I need to gain body weight? Fueling for the type of activity I do, right? We know if you're a lot more physically active, having a higher percentage of your diet from carbohydrates is probably going to fuel your performance better.
Yeah, I was just about to ask that actually. Like we spent all this time kind of talking about carbs and fats and saying basically it's not a factor for the most part at the end of the day in terms of weight loss results or even in terms of disease risk based on most of the existing research that we have as of 2019. So is there any real reason, and as you were just alluding to there, is there any real reason to modify carbs and fats one way or the other?
Yeah, and it really comes down to, one, personal preference, right? What do you enjoy eating and is satisfying to you? The other is what's your physical activity level, right? Is we know carbohydrates tend to refill muscle glycogen better than other sources. We know they're more easily usable for glucose sources during exercise, and that sustained energy output, so sustained physical activity, really does require some level of carbohydrate consumption for optimal performance. So those are kind of the two ways that you shift people's macronutrients around, right? Is what's their preference and then what's their kind of energy output need in terms of like actual power and sustained work.
Yeah. Does it matter as far as like high intensity versus endurance activities?
It tends to be more the volume of the work, right? So if you're doing 30 minutes of super high intensity work, you probably need a little bit more carbohydrates than somebody who's not doing any. But if you're doing 4 hours a day of sustained moderate level work, you're going to need more carbohydrates than the other person, right? And so there's kind of this total amount of workload that's done is a really good metric to determine that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So, Dr. Dieter, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Last question I have for you is there any sort of one or two big takeaways that you want to leave people with as like, maybe some of the most important principles of health or good nutrition from your perspective?
Yeah. I think probably the big one would be to let people know they have a lot of options that they can use. That a lot of different diets have benefits and can work, and kind of finding the one that fits your lifestyle the best at the current moment is probably the best way to do it, right? Like my diet's changed over my lifetime. Your diet can change over your lifetime, and realizing you've got a lot of flexibility there. That's probably the first piece. The second piece would be to kind of anchor it in your kind of health and fitness life, and this idea of how can I sustain this over a long period of time, right? I think a lot of people pick up habits that are pretty quick hitters and try to get things done pretty quickly. But if you can start to view it as I always use financial stuff to kind of get things across my clients. I think about think about your retirement account, right? You can either try to save $2 million this month, or you can start accumulating assets, pretty steadily. And then by the end, you'll get there and you won't have this crazy, you've got to go rob a bank to get $2 million, right? And so I try to tell people that with their kind of health and fitness, right? Is, dietary wise, start working on kind of what are the fundamental principles and skills, right? Is learning how to balance energy, learning what types of foods have which nutrients, how do you prepare your own food, how do you fuel yourself over different periods of your life, exercise, right? Kind of the same thing as how do you develop habits that actually kind of sustain it over the long term? Because we're not all going to be 20, 30-year-old super fit people our whole lives, but how can you, during those periods of your life where you are, just super fit, super active, how do you use that to kind of translate into your 40s and 50s?
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Beautiful. Perfect. And then as you just alluded to, you work with clients. So do you want to tell people where they can reach out to you if they want to work with you, and what kind of work do you do, and who is your ideal client?
Yeah. So all of the coaching that I'm involved in is with a company called Macros Inc. So we do one-on-one coaching with people, primarily nutrition coaching. We also do some training programming as well. Our ideal client is really people who are, kind of interested in developing the fundamentals of kind of a lifetime of success, right? So we coach our clients about what are the key principles of weight management, what are the key principles of dietary nutrition, advice for your current goal, and then also kind of in the future. So we're really focused on finding clients and kind of grooming clients for that kind of mindset of this is how we just instill habits in people.
Beautiful. I want to say to everybody listening, I interview a lot of people on the podcast. There's people I interview on the podcast that they have lots of things they believe in and endorse that I don't agree with and don't think are accurate reflections of the science. In this case, I just want to let everybody know that with Dr. Dieter, this is someone I have massive respect for, and I think is doing great work that is an extremely accurate reflection of the science as of 2019. And I would give my highest endorsement and recommendation to, as far as if you guys want to reach out and work with him. I receive no commission or kickbacks or anything if any of you guys sign up with him. I just wanted to let you know, because I do know that there are people listening that this has been commented on. When I have some people on the show who are saying a perspective that they know I don't particularly agree with, and I'm fine with that. Like, I don't necessarily think I'm right on every issue. I sometimes host people on the podcast that I don't agree with, and basically my attitude is convince me, show me where I'm wrong. Maybe I'm the one who's wrong, And so I think those conversations are important to have. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I do think my reading of the literature and my understanding is thorough, obviously. And Dr. Dieter is certainly someone that I would give my highest recommendation to, and would have no qualms about sending like my mother to, for example. So I just wanted to say that so everybody listening knows that I personally endorse you. Dr. Dieter, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was really a pleasure, and I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with my audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the more than kind words that you just gave, and really appreciated the conversation and look forward to hopefully connecting in person sometime.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks so much. Hey there, this is Ari again. One more quick thing before you go. Just make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Energy Blueprint, and also make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or anything else. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview, and I will see you again next week.